Alright, so what we got today is a Jetson Bolt Pro. My neighbor bought it used for his kids and having some trouble with the brakes. So I just fixed the back. The front's got the same issue, so I'm going to go through the process of redoing the front brake calipers. It does have mechanical disc brakes, which is actually pretty cool, but that's what they look like there. First thing we're going to do is go ahead and get those brakes off. I'm just going to take the whole caliper off because we're going to tear the whole thing down and rebuild it. So tools you'll need for the most part, actually to get it off, the only thing you're going to need is a 4mm Allen wrench. So first you want this bolt here. That's what takes the cable. That's what tightens the cable. So that's going to snap open when you do that. And we want to take this cable completely out because we're going to take the whole caliper off the bike, take the caliper over to the workbench and redo it over there. So that bolt comes out, and then you're going to want to just take this whole thing off here by turning it to the left, and then that whole cable will pull out. So now the entire cable is free from the caliper. Now this little guy here, this little deal here, I'm going to leave it on here because the end of this brake cable is a little bit frayed, and if you take that off, that's a real pain to get back on if that cable's frayed. And then sometimes it'll have a little crimp on here the way the rear one does. So unless you want to remove and redo that crimp, I'd recommend not taking that thing all the way out. So we're just going to leave that there. There's a little spring inside there. Don't lose the spring. That drops down in there. I'm just going to tuck this up, or leave it where it is. I'm going to put this up on the bench so we don't lose it. So the next step is to get this brake caliper itself off of the fork, or if you're doing the rear, off of the frame. So there's two bolts. You could take these two bolts off, but these two bolts tend to be really tight because they put Loctite on them from the factory. And you're going to have to take these bolts off anyway, because once we put it back on, we're going to need to adjust it, and these are the bolts you use to adjust it. So you might as well just take these off. That way you don't have to worry about these guys. If you do take these guys off, make sure you have some blue Loctite to put them back on, because you're going to want to Loctite those back in place so they don't vibrate loose. Alright, so remember how this comes off. These bolts, basically they go through the caliper here, and then there's a total of 3 washers, and the reason for that is that gives you the ability to have a little bit of play and adjustment in this. And notice those bolts, or excuse me, those holes are slotted. That allows you to adjust this caliper to where it needs to be on the rotor. But just remember the order in which those 3 go on there, because you'll need to obviously put those back in the right order. Alright, so we got the caliper off. Let's get it up to the bench and get working on it. Alright, so now we're up here on the workbench with the caliper. Got it all taken off. So first thing we're going to do is take the pads out. So if you need to change the pads, you could watch this. You could change the pads with it on the bike. You don't need to take it off, but we're going to take the pads out for this anyway. This thing here is basically for the adjustment. As the pads wear, you run that in to account for wear in the pads. We're going to take that out. there's a little spring in between these pads. That little silver piece right there, you just want to pull that straight out. It just keeps the pads separated. And then the pads come out one at a time, like this. You tip that up like that and push it straight out. These pads are actually brand new. I had put these in and then I realized that they were all out of adjustment, and I spent the last couple hours learning about this brake caliper when I did the rear. So those are brand new pads. If you have old pads, obviously they have less meat on them there. But for now, those are our brand new pads that we'll put back in there when we're done. So then this part here, I'm not sure what you'd actually call this, but it's a 4mm bolt to take that out, and that is spring loaded, so you're going to want to hold it kind of like this when you're taking that bolt out so it doesn't pop apart on you. So I take the bolt out there, that part comes out, there's a spring with a little grommet on there, and then this piece here, this is the actual piston. So we'll put this back on temporarily. So what happens is when you pull the brake, this cable pulls this, and as it gets pulled, you know, notice it's got a hex on there. As it gets pulled, what happens is the caliper moves in. You can see that moving in a little bit. Maybe if we look at it from the other side, you can see that gap closing as the brake gets pulled. So that's what this piston is, what squeezes the pads together on the rotor, which obviously slows you down. So the inside of this, slide this stuff out of the way. Now be careful when you're taking this apart, because this piston, there's nothing holding it now. Right now I'm holding it with my finger inside of the caliper, but if I were to let my finger go, this would fall. It would fall right out. And you got to be careful because there's 3 little balls in there. Little ball bearings. You'll see them in a second. But they're what actually, as this thing rotates, they're what actually rolls inside there. So I'm going to let this thing fall. And one of the balls came out with it, and then the other 2 balls stayed in there. Where's my... Use that to get those out. There's one. There's the other. Right inside there. Pull those out. And then our third one stuck with the piston here. So that's how that works. Those balls have little parts that are shaped, so when this thing turns, it pushes, and then there's a matching piece on the inside there. So the balls are squeezed in between there. When this thing rotates, that's what actually pushes it in that direction. So what I'm going to do, it's got some grease on it. I'm going to clean all this old grease off. I'm going to put new grease in there. Now, one thing about grease, you don't want to get any grease on the pads or the rotor. So I'm just kind of sliding those a little further out of the way. You get grease on brake pads, obviously they're not going to work right. I think maybe you can clean them, but I'm not sure if you'd ever be able to get all the grease off. So just be really careful not to get any on there. We'll just clean all these little, get as much of this grease off as we can. Being really careful not to drop these, because they would be hard to find on the floor of my garage. The way my luck goes, they'd roll underneath the freezer or something. I'd never see them again. So then I also want to get down here in the caliper, clean that grease out. Now that piece that's in there, I'm sure I could probably press that out if I really wanted to. I don't really want to. I'd rather just leave it in there. That way I know it's in the right position that the factory put it in when they ship this. So, use some fresh grease here. I just have a big tube of multi-purpose grease. I've had this for years, and obviously not a whole lot of it has been used. It's still fairly new. We don't need a ton of grease in this case, so what I'm going to do is get a little screwdriver here. Just give me a little dab of grease on the end of that screwdriver, and I'm going to put it right there where the ball goes. Do that in all 3 locations. Three little dabs of grease, and then that way when we put the ball in there, we can just mash the ball down into the grease, and that helps hold the ball in place for us while we're putting this back together. We don't have to worry about those flying all over the place when I'm trying to get this piston back into the caliper. Alright, so now they hold in place like that, not going anywhere. Get our grease back out of the way. And then basically this is going to go back in place like this. And I want to give it a little twist just to work that grease in. Get that grease all into the mitting locations. Alright, so before I put the other piece back on, what I learned when I was doing the rear side one, this wants to fall out, right? There's nothing holding that in there. So when you're trying to compress this spring and put this back on and get the screw started and get all that going with nothing holding this in place, it's a real pain. So what I did to alleviate that was put the brake pads back in. I'm holding this, piston side down, so the piston's hanging down. Put these back in. They got a little tab on them. The tab goes through that slot and the back, like so. And then the easiest thing I've found is to take your little spring that goes between them, and you slide that in there and it snaps in place. You might be able to hear it on the camera, I don't know. You can hear it a little bit. You can feel it better than you hear it, but it snaps in place. You can see where there's a little hole in the caliper where that snaps in place. So now we kind of have the calipers holding this in here, but I want to hold this all the way over here because we're going to be putting a lot of pressure on this thing when we're putting it back together. So this adjustment plug, I'm going to put it back in. It's a 5mm to run that down. And what I'm actually going to do, you can see the gap, and you'll see that it start closing as I'm tightening this down. What I'm going to do is run that all the way in. I'm not going to tighten it super tight, but basically what I've done now, I'm using this adjustment plug. I've adjusted it all the way down to hold the piston in place. The piston is no longer movable. It's completely stationary now, so that way I can put as much pressure on this as I want to when I'm putting this back together. So, and we also know that the piston is in the completely retracted position. So notice, this is a hex, and this has a hex on the inside. So this can go on in a number of different ways. And what I found was when whoever did this the last time, whoever my neighbor bought these things from, it was in this position. So naturally, it doesn't have very much travel. When I was putting it back together, I actually put it back together in this position. In that case, it has too much travel, and it can't have more than 120 degrees of rotation because there's 3 balls in there. 360 degrees per rotation divided by 120, or divided by 3 is 120 degrees. So we can't go any further than 120 degrees. So that's the sweet spot of where it wants to be. It's going to be in the all the way retracted position here, and that also makes it where when this thing pulls this way, it doesn't pull it so far that the balls inside skip. When you put it in that orientation, it pulls it far enough where the balls inside of there that that are actuating that piston, they'll actually skip over to the next one, and then once they do that, the caliper doesn't work right anymore. You'll have no braking force at all. It just it gets the travel limits all out of whack. So that's where you want it. If you're holding it up like this, you want it to be, you know, if you're holding the two tabs, I'm sorry, we're not in field of view, or if you're holding the two tabs like this, you kind of want this to be at the 2 o'clock position if this were the face of a clock. So what I did on the other one, I made myself a little scribe mark, just a tiny little, this is aluminum, I don't have to worry about it rusting, but now I have a mark that's showing me right there, you know, how I want this lined up. I don't want it lined up like that, I don't want it lined up like that, I want it to where those two marks are lined up. Probably could have put a little piece of tape or something like that, but it was quick to just knock a little scribe mark. Okay, so the next step is this crazy little spring. So notice this spring has these tabs on either end. There are holes for those tabs to go into. Now on this piece, there's a hole here and then a hole on the other side. That hole on the other side is not actually cut deep enough. Notice how that's not going all the way down in there. You want to go in this hole up here, slightly smaller diameter, that's where that little tab goes. And same thing on the caliper side, there's a hole that little tab goes in. If you see that hole right there. Now, same thing, for some reason, there's a hole over here on the other side, or something that looks like a hole. It is not big enough for that little tab to go in there. So you're going to want to make sure you're putting this in the right location. The purpose of the spring is what's going to open it back up. So when you pull the brake lever, when you release the brake lever, this spring is what opens the piston back up and releases the brakes. But we need this little grommet on here. I think that's just to keep dirt and debris out of here. First get this lined up, and now you notice when we the tabs on the spring are now engaged in both. It's engaged in the caliper and engaged in this, but notice our marks aren't lined up. So you've got to line those up a little bit. So I'm twisting this back this direction, and I'm twisting against that spring, so it's giving me some resistance. So you twist against the spring, and you push down, and notice my marks are lined up, and my hex is engaged there. Now if I were to let this go, it would fly off because I'm engaging that spring. So what you got to do is I set that down on the table, I'm still pushing down on it, I can grab my bolt and put in there from up above. Just like that. Get that good and tight. Now it won't move right now because again our adjustment plug, we've adjusted that, we've ran it all the way in. So now I'm going to loosen that, and you'll see the gap start opening back up, just like that. So now we'll be able to rotate this now, and notice when we rotate it, that gap is closing. We're simulating, you know, the cable would pull this when whoever's riding the bike pulls the brake handle, and you should feel a pretty good bit of resistance there. You're compressing that spring as you're rotating, so you want to have some pretty good resistance there. Otherwise, it's not gonna return. Before we get it back on the bike, one thing I want to talk about a little bit with this adjustment plug. So the purpose of this adjustment plug, as the brakes wear, the pads become less thick. There's less material. So the idea behind this is that as the brakes wear and you have less pad material on there, you run that in just a little bit. Now notice you don't have to turn that thing very much for that to change. I mean, I bet, you know, that's the whole, let's see, that's the whole brake there, and I only turned it maybe a rotation and a half. Let's see, one rotation, 2 rotations. So 2 rotations to get the whole thing. So that tells you that you don't have to turn this thing very much to make a big adjustment on that that stationary brake pad. And this thing's, I mean, it's awfully loose, right? Now, one thing I notice, it has this bolt that's supposed to hold it in place. So this is a set screw that holds that adjustment plug in place. So once you get the adjustment plug where you want it, you're supposed to run that bolt down, and then the adjustment plug is tight and it doesn't move anymore. If you don't run that down as you ride the bike, this thing's going to move around on you, and your brakes aren't going to consistently work the way that they're supposed to. So I'm going to loosen that back up because I will make that adjustment once I get it on the bike. Alright, so that's the brake caliper, completely rebuilt, new grease, feels really nice. When we pull that, we'll get this put back on the bike and take it for a spin, see how it goes. Okay, we are ready to get this thing back on the bike. So it's going to go on like this. But first, I want to reinstall the cable. So if you recall, there's this little cable adjustment that we already took off. I want to get that back on there. So first, put the spring back on. It's a lot easier when these things have one of the little anti-fray plugs or whatever they're called crimped on. This one doesn't, obviously. That's okay. Just be careful with it. So that piece goes together like that. And now we're ready to slide the caliper on there. That's first the cable's gonna go through. And then we're gonna screw this guy in. For now, I'm going to screw that all the way in. Next thing we're going to do is go ahead and get our cable bolt and nut. So the place where the nut goes is a little bit, it's like hex shaped. So that little hex drops right down in there, screws in from the other side with a 5mm Allen wrench. So I'm not going to tighten it all the way right now because obviously we're going to adjust that once we get it in place. But that is ready to put the caliper back on. So I talked about these caliper bolts a little bit when I took them off, but basically there's 3 washers and you're just going to want to make sure you put those back on the way that you took them off. So it goes a washer, the caliper, another washer, and then the thicker washer. And those washers, they're not just any old washer, they're kind of conical shaped, so they have the ability to adjust as far as angle is concerned. So first we're going to do the bottom one. Put that on there. Put that little conical shaped one on, and then put that one on. And we're going to be careful not to let those fall off, because if they fall off, it's a pain. Alright, we don't want to tighten that all the way just yet, because we got to do the same thing with the other one. Put the bolt in first, and then it goes this one, then this one. Those can be a little painful to get on there. But there we go. When you're done, yours should look like that. Just like that. Alright. Run those in a little bit closer. So I have adjusted the that adjustment plug for the stationary side. I adjusted that one in just a little bit because basically I want to be able to pull about half the travel distance on the movable side. Before it starts engaging. So I've gotten that tightened down accordingly. So when you do that, basically I move that into place and then tighten that bolt while I was pulling on the string. That way when I pull the handle, you don't want to see it pulling all the way back. You want to see it, you know, stopping the wheel about halfway. Something like that. So I'm going to make sure all my bolts are tight and then take her for a test drive.